So, hello and welcome to the Fresh Air Sci-Fi Show. I'm Joe,
And I'm Dave.
and tonight we're going to be discussing, well, atheism, but we're going to be
For a
doing it,
change.
yeah, just for a change. But we're going to be discussing Anthony Flue's work from 1972, called "The Presumption of Atheism." Yes, Chris, we are bloody amateurs. Actually, that's
It's
completely
part of our
true.
charm.
We don't get paid for this shit. We just do it for fun.
Yeah. Also, hello, Chris, and hello, Philip.
Yeah, nice to see you. Oh, and hey, Philip, I missed your hello there. I can see you now, though. Cool. So yes, hopefully you're all okay, and you all made it through my terrible mixing at the start. I must say, I'm really frustrated with YouTube. I'm just going to have a rant about this now because I need to. They have decided to get rid of the Save as New feature, which is really annoying because what I used to do was get the stream and I would cut the bits, like any music that we've done out of it. I would always do the highlights in Twitch anyway because they were easier to actually do the highlights in Twitch. But just separating the music from the main video was really easy. And now they said, yeah, if you want to do it, you've got to download it and re-upload it. Thanks, YouTube. Always seems to be Google getting rid of, features saying no one uses it that I've always used, like on Hangouts, right? I don't know if you ever use the messaging program Hangouts, but it also had the ability to send SMS messages, and they would go to SMS. So it didn't matter. They didn't have to have the app like WhatsApp. You could actually just send an SMS message, and if they had both apps themselves, the messages would come through in the same program, so you could always see them there. It was really useful. They got rid of the merge messaging, so they were two different things, and then they got rid of SMS altogether. And it was like, well, you're just a messaging app that no one else really uses other than me. So now I don't use Hangouts, and they've now made it really awkward with the videos. But anyway, that was the rant that I really needed to get off my chest. And I tell you what, I don't really feel that much better because it hasn't resolved the problem. All they've done is create me extra work.
Well, that's computing in general. Every single app that you will ever use, as it grows, you find it removes the features that were good and useful and increases it with bloated stuff that nobody needs, wants, or will ever find useful.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a whole block in the computing science degree that's removing useful features and making your software more of a pain in the ass.
I could actually believe that was true.
I could.
Oh man, how's all of that going, by the way?
Oops.
Yeah, look, got a tan now. Hey.
Not just that, you froze for a second there.
Oh, did I?
Turning on the light seemed to freeze everything.
Oh dear.
And now you're out of sync.
I'm out of sync? Oh, well, at your end?
About a second and a half.
Oh, that's really
at
weird.
my end.
That's very weird.
No, it's caught up now.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, so how's all that going, actually? Your course and everything?
Well, as you know, I kind of fell behind.
Yeah.
But I've pretty much caught up now. I had an exam this morning, got an exam tomorrow, an assignment due on Thursday, and an assignment due on Tuesday.
That's quite a lot of work. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, maybe we need to keep tonight short just so you can get off. I've also just noticed that your name is showing as Philip.
He's much smarter than me. I'd rather be known as him anyway.
There you go. You're Dave now.
Aw.
Hey, you can't steal the man's cred.
No.
So, yeah, as I was saying, we're going to be discussing Flue's The Presumption of Atheism tonight. Do you want to take us away and give us a little bit about that, Dave?
Okay, so Flue in 72, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
He argued that he wanted to change the way that atheism was seen by most people.
Yep.
So rather than it being seen as the belief that there is no God, he wanted to broaden the category so that it was just people who didn't believe in a god. And so you start from atheism, and you start from the presumption that not that there is no God, but just that there's no reason to believe in God.
Hmm.
Um, Many people kind of say, "Oh, well, it's just agnosticism," but it's not.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because Flew wasn't arguing that you should assess the evidence and kind of withhold judgment. He was saying that with his version of atheism, you don't necessarily have to assess the evidence. Um, he was the first to use the trial. Sort of, you're not accusing God of being guilty of existing. You're saying he's not guilty. But also, you don't even have to assess the concept itself, because you start from the assumption that there is no kind of coherent definition being given.
Sort of like agnosticism in a way.
No, that's what I just said. Not like agnosticism,
No, not
but
agnosticism.
agnosticism.
Yeah. So it's not.
Sorry, I
Yeah.
misheard you.
So he's talking about a coherent definition of God. That sounds like what we would have called agnosticism in that regard.
Yeah, but again, agnosticism assumes that you have assessed the concept and come to the conclusion that it's incoherent. But with the Blues version, you don't even have to have assessed it. You just say, present me with a coherent sort of concept. So you start the conversation without even assuming that they have evidence, assuming that they have a coherent definition, anything like that. But you start with the assessment that you don't believe it.
Hmm. So
We'll see as we go through it.
yeah, I mean, in a way, it sounds almost like agnosticism light.
Yeah, sort of. As well as agnosticism light and even sort of atheism light.
So, did you want to go through some of the article? Do you want to pull up the screen? If you do, I can switch it
Yeah.
to be right back mode briefly.
Yeah, I've got the article loaded up.
Okie dokie.
I figure rather than reading it out, we'll just go through it because I think it's about 10 pages long.
Yeah, we don't need to go through the whole thing.
No.
Right. So let me quickly
Sort of do what we did with the Mino.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So let's just put the audio playlist on. Ready when you are.
It can only be attributable to human error.
Is that showing?
It is indeed. So I'll switch back. There we go. We're back already. That was quicker. We're almost getting not too bad at doing the changes between scenes.
Aye. Well, it's easy to organize having a file preloaded, but having the technical stuff sorted out.
We're getting there. We're getting there, though.
Yeah.
We're getting there. I hope.
We would lose all of our charm if we got there.
That's true. I mean, sort of paraphrasing and bastardizing it completely, but Philip the other day said, "I like how crap you are."
Yep. Okay, so I've moved out of Discord now, so I can't actually see.
That's probably for the best.
No. Okay. So Flew starts out by discussing what he means by presumption.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of as in the final line here, as you can see, the presumption of atheism is closely analogous to the presumption of innocence in the English law, and which is what he uses the court case analogy to show. And we kind of see this court case analogy appearing a lot within the atheist community with the whole, I'm not saying that God is guilty of not existing, I'm just saying that I find him not guilty of existing. I'm not, I'm not making a claim. When you say somebody's not guilty, you're not saying they're innocent, and there's a lot of that in this paper.
Right. Oh,
Yeah, sorry, hit the wrong button.
fair enough.
The word atheism, however, has in this contention to be construed unusually. And you get a lot of people who argue, like Randolph and plenty others, who argue that atheism has always meant without gods.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I've just done an article that's going to be released tomorrow that actually breaks down all the etymology and uses of atheism throughout time, and I'm sure it's not completely exhaustive, but it's one of the more complete lists that I've seen. So yes, it hasn't always meant that.
No. I mean, even in the Greek times, it didn't exactly mean without belief. It meant without the gods themselves.
Yeah. And so just for context, the original use was basically something along the lines of like God forsaken. And then it was someone that didn't believe in the gods of the state. So there's two uses there. The direct translation of the etymological root did come to without gods, but like when you translate from French or Italian or something like that into English, and the direct translation doesn't make sense, you sort of have to rephrase it to your tongue. That's sort of the same thing. Just because a direct translation of the words might mean something in English doesn't mean that that's how it was used, and the same can be said for the original Greek atheos.
Yeah. And I mean, the way it's used today, if I remember right, actually came from the French atheisme in about 1400, 1500,
In the 1500s.
something like that. 1500s, yeah. I
Yeah,
couldn't remember exactly.
which at that point it meant denial or disbelief in gods.
Yeah. And that's basically where we get the modern version of atheism from. Not the Greek version, but the French version.
Mm-hmm.
And Flu says that here. Like, there's a lot of people who take on a lot of what Flu says, mostly through what other people are saying, rather than reading Flu's paper firsthand, because I don't think a lot of the theists have actually read this paper.
Yeah.
But Flu says here, whereas nowadays the usual meaning of atheist in English is someone who asserts that there is no such being as God, I want the word to be understood here much less positively. I want the original Greek prefix a to read in the same way in atheist as in other Greco English words like amoral, atypical, and asymmetrical. So we can see here that he's saying that he wants to flip what the A means from not to without.
And just for context, if you weren't aware, not is used as negation, so it's the
Yeah.
it's the opposite of something. That's what we mean by that.
So here he says, in this interpretation, an atheist becomes not someone who positively asserts the non-existence of God, but someone who is simply not a theist. And we see that now,
Mm-hmm.
where lots of atheists are conflating atheism with non-theism.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that is one of the very, very common ones that you see today. And then they'll go, it literally means not theist. And you're like,
Yeah.
okay.
And that sort of comes from Flu. And it's kind of interesting because it shows you how long it's taken for Flu's idea to actually take off in the atheist community.
Mm. Yeah.
Because it sort of started around 2010, around there, didn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I honestly can't tell you where that became commonplace. It's something that I have been looking for in that article I was writing. I couldn't find where this sort of came to be. And looking through all the definitions and the common uses, it's this incredibly broad use. Even still, I mean, in a what was it? The Oxford Dictionary of Atheism did mention a similar sort of use from its 2016 entry. um, but that's quite a long way after this, and it seems to be the first sort of time it's transpired past this bit of work that Flew did to be in an atheist dictionary. Yeah.
I can actually remember it becoming popular around 2010, maybe 2008. And it started out with early in the 2000s after the whole Four Horsemen thing.
That was 2006, wasn't it? The new atheist movement was coined anyway, 2006.
I'd say it probably started a little before that.
I just meant the coining of new
but yeah.
atheism. But yeah.
Oh yeah. And even then, people were still arguing that agnostic was a scared atheist, and that atheism didn't always mean belief that God did not exist. Sometimes it meant just not believing God exists. And then that slowly morphed into a lack of belief over the span of about 4 or 5 years.
And now you get your head bitten off suggesting it is anything but that.
Yeah. And it's kind of weird. And as we can see, the person who sort of coined the idea even admits himself that it was that. I mean, this is going back to 1972, but if it's taken that long to permeate into common atheist parlance, it shows that for quite a while it still remained what it was when he lists, the belief God does not exist. And if you go back to dictionaries in the 80s, you'll see it listed as that, and in the 90s.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, even in the early 2000s, with the exception of maybe internet dictionaries after this started taking place. But yeah.
I mean,
sorry, just while I do that, just a relevant topic. Chris says he really dislikes the term new atheism. I think I can understand why you might dislike the term, because it's often used as a dismissive insult these days. And it's also a descriptor for that all atheists get put under. Now, new atheism was just supposed to be atheists actually challenging theists in the right way, in a rational way, in a respectful way, but it turned into, I only lack belief, I don't have to support myself. I don't have to justify anything I say, I only lack belief. And unfortunately, every atheist that might challenge a theist now gets grouped into that category of new atheist. And I mean, that's personally why I don't really like the term, and I try to avoid using it unless I'm trying to make a point. I don't know if that's why you also dislike it, Chris. Let us know.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of atheists today don't really understand the new atheism label, because when it's brought up, you'll hear a lot of them say something like, there's nothing new about atheism, it's been around for thousands of years.
Yeah.
So they don't even know the history of their own movement going back 10 years.
Yeah. I mean, a simple way to put it, new atheism is atheism activism. That's, and people will use the term atheism activism, or secular activism in a way. And I think that's probably a better term for it anyway, especially with how sour the term new atheism or new atheist has got. But I would definitely say that with that sour flavour of new atheist, there are definite people that when I look at and see those behaviours of someone that claims to be an atheist, I go, new atheist. In the same way that you sort of look at that young earth creationist or evangelical and you go, Bundy theist. It's that sort of thing. But yeah.
And you raise a good point, using secular activist instead. And I think if we were to start using that term, you would get people like Lord Bryant on your side, because there's a lot of Christians and deists and pantheists who believe in secularism, who want separation of church and state, who don't want creationism taught in schools. Um, but a lot of the sort of new atheists today disenfranchise them by being so aggressive against anyone who may believe in a god or some kind of god. Because, yes, ask them to justify why they believe, have a discussion about what they believe. But most today are just like, oh, well, you're dumb. You believe in a god. You're irrational. So it kind of disenfranchises them from the secular movement as such.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree with that. Um, it's I also think as well, you know, with atheists who are being prescriptive around the term atheism, they're pushing other forms of non-theists, or like you mentioned, secular theists. And there are secular theists. There are theists that don't have any form of religion, or they believe in a serious separation of church and state, even though they're really, you know, convinced by their religion, they believe in secularism as well. And so, yeah, if we did secular activism, and instead of addressing atheist issues, we address secular issues, it would just be a much better way of wording it. So Chris has come back and said, and also I believe that the theists didn't enjoy the simplicity and lack of philosophy in the new age of atheists. And I think you're right there. That is another big issue with the lack of belief atheist and that sort of dogma of, I don't have to justify my position, I don't have to do anything, I'm rational because I'm an atheist. I mean, no one really enjoys that other than the people in that in-group patting each other on the back. So I definitely agree with you there.
Yeah.
Computer Brain says new atheism TM according to Steve McRae. I mean, that's a good way of separating it in a way, like new atheism for what it was supposed to be versus new atheism TM to what it has become, if you want to do it that way. But maybe we should actually think about it in a different way. Like we were saying, use secular for these issues.
Yeah, and I mean, you could still have certain parts of atheist activism going on, because there are issues still important directly relating to atheists. But there is a lot of overlap between what atheists want and what secular. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think it sounds like it sounds like your internet's going a little bit funny at the moment.
It could be.
Just shutting down a bunch of things. Hey, Chesh, how you doing? Nice to have you here.
Hey, Chesh.
Yeah. Oh, good news though. I mean, hopefully it doesn't happen tonight, but the sound card issue should be resolved soon because they're going to send me out a new one. I need to send this one back as well, but they're replacing it because it's still in warranty. But it turns out that it's actually a sound card issue, so no, not so much of a rush on getting a new PC. It is. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Sorry, carry on.
So that's all right. So he admits that this is a new sense of the word atheism.
Yeah.
And he calls it Humpty Dumptyism. And the term Humpty Dumptyism comes from Alice in Wonderland, where Humpty Dumpty says that he can make words whatever they want them to mean. It's as simple as that. He's basically saying, this is the common usage, but I'm using it how I want it to mean.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, at the end of the day, language is our bitch, isn't it? We can use it however we like, as long as we explain how we're going to use it, if we're going to use it in an atypical way. So he has decided to use atheism in an atypical way. If you've just tuned in, I can see a few new people have joined the stream. We're discussing Flu's change the definition of atheism, which at the time in 1972 the common use was the belief God does not exist, and he was trying to change the definition to being without a belief in God and a specific type of not having a belief for his negative atheism as well.
Yeah. And I mean, he sort of addresses now why make it the presumption of atheism rather than the presumption of agnosticism, which is something you mentioned earlier, how it's sort of like agnosticism.
Hmm.
And I mean, you could kind of say it is based on the affirmation and non-affirmation of propositions. But he argues it fails to appreciate just how non-committal that he intends his version of atheism to be.
Mm.
Um, because in this context, like I mentioned earlier, agnostic um, is someone who has entertained the existence of God, at least as a theoretical possibility, and now claims not to know. But like he says here, in this ordinary sense, you already have conceded that there is a legitimate concept of God. Um, and the concept does, in fact, have application. But his version of atheism it doesn't even concede that. It doesn't even concede that there is a legitimate concept or that you could entertain the concept.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I see it like ignosticism rather than agnosticism, because an
Yeah.
igtheist is one that finds the whole concept of God meaningless. But what you're saying is the way he approached it was even sort of lighter than that, like an agnostic. I mean, what is the difference there? Because I'm having trouble seeing the difference between his version of the negative atheist and the ignostic.
Okay. The term agnostic wasn't really around then. It's kind of a new concept. So he wasn't really aware of that word.
But I mean that makes sense because I mean the term agnosticism appeared 12 years before he did this paper, but we've seen how long it took for his ideas here to sort of feed through to the atheist community. So it would make sense that he himself was not aware of being agnostic as the same sort of moniker, I guess. Hey, Randolph. Hey, Bearded Heretic. Nice to see you guys.
Hey guys. Yeah. So it wasn't really popularized. I mean, he was an academic, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everything had filtered through by then. Because, 40 years for this to become popular in the community itself.
Mm.
And in the 80s, people began arguing against flu. So that's about 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and again, there's a major difference between agnostic and flu's version of atheist in that the agnostic has looked at the concept of God
Yeah.
and gone, that's incoherent. Whereas flu is sort of arguing that you don't even have to look at it. You just say, you've not presented me with a coherent thing. Why should I assume that you have a coherent definition of God?
Yeah, so it's a step or two before. His goalpost is like really at the ground.
Yeah.
Right.
It's to use an American sort of thing. It's before the quarterback has kicked the ball.
Right.
Yeah. Or like um what's the rugby term when they kick the ball through the thing? It's the try is when they place it on the ground.
Yeah,
But
conversion.
imagine if
I can't remember.
conversion, that's it. Yeah. So imagine you see the guy running to kick the ball, you aren't even presuming that he's gonna necessarily even hit the ball before presuming whether he is gonna actually score the conversion.
Yeah, fair enough.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're not making any presumption at all. You, you just know that this word try exists or conversion exists.
Hmm.
Um, so he then says he wants the debate about God to be kind of conducted in a certain way. Um, the onus of proof involves that it is up to the theist first to introduce and defend his proposed concept of God, and second, to provide sufficient reason for believing that this concept of his does in fact have an application.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that it's fair to say that the theists should introduce their concept of God, but I think as well the other side of it is, as an overview, we have a general idea of what the concept of God is. So, swings and roundabouts with that one. Especially if we're talking God with the capital G of the Abrahamic faiths.
Yeah. But I mean, even then, you can sort of see that with the different amount of denominations and how many different people's ideas of what God is there are lots of concepts of God floating around. They might have kind of base similarities,
Mm-hmm.
but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're all going to be argued the same way.
Yeah, this is true.
Um,
We know that from
yeah,
conversations that we've had with this online.
yeah, exactly. So, and we sort of see this now filtering through into the atheist community, where a lot of the argument is just, you've not met your burden of proof. Show me the proof. Show me the proof.
Mm-hmm. Which isn't exactly the
But
right way to
they
go
sort of
about it.
differ in that. No, definitely not. Especially not if you start with you haven't met your burden of proof. Because even Flew isn't starting with that as such. He's not saying you haven't met your burden of proof. He's just saying, I don't know what proof you have. I don't even know what you're discussing yet until you present me with this concept.
Yeah. He's basically saying, right, give me your concept, your particular concept of God. Now tell me why I should believe it. And I suppose even in that
Yeah,
sense,
exactly.
if they got to that within Flu's work, he would he still address the other side of it? So, if someone gave him a concept of God that was ill-defined, he'd go, well, this is ill-defined because of X, Y, Z.
Yeah,
And if
he
they
would.
Right, and that's something that we often don't see from fellow atheists out there. They won't even address that, and then they talk about the evidence or the reasons to believe, the justification. We often see atheists at this point going, "No, you haven't met your burden of proof. That's not evidence. That's not this." But they don't address why they don't accept it, and that's part of the justification side of things that we're also talking about. Regardless of your ontological position, even if you just lack a belief, you should explain why you don't accept their claim, why you don't accept their evidence or their arguments. And it's quite easy to do in a lot of states. I mean, you could even address a particular God claim saying, well, if you think about A, B, C, they contradict each other. They don't work with each other. Therefore, you've got a contrary definition of it. Would you accept a square circle? No, because that's logically impossible. Just like the definition of your God, or the evidence, the arguments you provided me for your God. And that's what's meant by justification in these conversations.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if somebody came up to you and said that a square circle can exist in some possible world, you're within your right to say, well, no, that's impossible. We can't even conceive of a square circle. Now, you'll get a lot of people who will say it will make quite a bad argument. And it's a similar argument to what some people make when they argue when you argue 1 + 1 does not equal 3, it's 2. And that's what they'll do is they'll say, well, I can conceive of a world where people use the term circle to describe a square. So therefore, I can conceive of a square circle. But that's not what conceiving of a square circle means, because they're still conceiving of a square. They're just renaming the term. They're not actually conceiving of the concept of a circle that is square. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I definitely. I mean, I've also heard another argument of it the other day, where someone was talking about a square circle. And if you shine a light from a certain angle, you see a shadow of a circle, and from another one you see, because it was, and I was like, but you're describing a completely different shape. It, just because you can look
Yeah.
at from this shape from one end and it looks like that, and this end from another end it looks like, you're not actually describing a square circle. So again, it's it's not actually thinking of a square circle. It's the
That's it.
same sort of one. Just like to say hello everyone who has been just joined the chat and joined in the last few minutes. Since Luke came in, it's Lord Brian. Leon, I don't know if I said hello to you yet. How you doing? Maverick, Cafe, and anyone else who I've missed, I do apologize. Thank you for joining into the chat. I will get to some of your comments as soon as possible, but I don't want to interrupt Dave too much.
It's all right. Interrupt away. But yeah, this is sort of like sometimes you'll get people who say, when you say 1 + 1 = 2 in all possible worlds, and they say, well, no, I can conceive of 1 + 1 = 3, and they use a similar argument and say, what if I use the term 3 to describe 2?
It's again, it's a redefinition.
Again, that's it. You're still describing the same number, even though you're using a different numeral.
Yeah. So if we were to do it with fingers, we wouldn't ever get that plus that equals that. We'd just be saying that is 3, which is redefining what that is. So hopefully you could see my fingers. I forgot I had the small camera up at the moment. But yeah, so without redefining something, which obviously you can do, these things are logically impossible.
Yeah.
And there are certain arguments for gods that you could definitely say are equally logically impossible. And they need a hell of a lot of apologetics and excuses to get round these particular arguments.
Yeah. And you're within good reason, or you have good reason and within your rights to say, well, that is incoherent and contradictory. So therefore, I find it logically incoherent. Even if you don't say logically impossible, you can say, well, look, I just don't find it logically incoherent. And I don't think it's conceivable that that thing could exist in that particular way.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then just try and elicit, further response. It's usually at this time, though, and this is one of the things about metaphysical claims that always end up being so hard to disprove, is the fact that there is a lot of goalpost moving from the theists in this regard. They've given something, you've pointed out how it doesn't make sense, so then they go, yeah, but I mean this. And then you might point out how that might not make sense or that might not work, and then they'll move on to the next bit. And it'll be this ongoing thing. And eventually you end up with what they first described being quite different to what they're describing now, but still able to link it all together and show how it doesn't make sense. But I think it's still better to hold that conversation and demonstrate why it doesn't make sense than it is to just say, you haven't met your burden of proof,
Yeah, exactly. And by doing it that way, you'll either help them sharpen their argument, which is always good, even if it's somebody who doesn't believe the same thing as you. You're helping them to think more rationally, or they'll end up questioning the concept itself and maybe beginning a journey of questioning the entire belief system.
Which, anyone questioning anything. I mean, I like it when someone puts something to me that makes me really think. There are times where in that particular conversation it won't necessarily make me think there and then, but I'll sleep on it and then I'll think about it and I'll go over and over and over it in my mind. Essentially, all you can really do to change someone's mind is sow seeds. They're only going to change their mind themselves, but they're going to be more receptive to it if you have a good conversation with them than if you just put up walls and fight and insult and all that sort of thing. So I think there's definite better ways of doing things.
Yeah, and I mean, even Flu is suggesting that here, because he's suggesting argue first the concept of God and, get them to show that their proposed concept of God is defensible to begin with. and then get to the discussion about sufficient reason for believing. And sufficient reason does not necessarily mean present me with physical evidence. It just means sufficient justifications for believing that this concept is worth believing.
Yeah, definitely.
He goes on to then describe, because you get, like, say, the Santa argument or the Loch Ness Monster argument. So the question of existent concerns, for instance, a Loch Ness Monster or the abominable snowman, this stage may perhaps reasonably be deemed to be more or less complete before the argument begins, because everybody, when you speak of the Loch Ness Monster or the abominable snowman, most people mean the same thing when they say the Loch Ness Monster. It's a sort of big monster, dinosaur-like, that lives in Loch Ness.
Yeah, sort of from all the they've even got the idea of sort of like the Diplodocus neck,
Yeah.
or I can't remember, but the aquatic one that looks sort of like that. That's what everybody seems to think of that. And again, with the abominable snowman, it's sort of like a giant yeti type thing. You know.
Yeah, that's it. It's a big hairy man who wanders around in the snow, sort of looks like a cross between an ape and a man. There's sort of common definitions that everybody has and common properties that everybody has for these things, even if there is slight variation. But when it comes to the term God, there's way more variation than there is in ideas like Loch Ness Monster and Abominable Snowman.
Yeah, even with core concepts, like even if you look at the omni deity, the three omnis, although sometimes people even say one of them, like omnibenevolence, it's not omnibenevolence, it's just benevolence or perfect benevolence, and it's just omniscience and oh fuck, all powerful. What's the word for powerful? I've forgotten it. My mind has gone.
Omnipotent?
Yeah, omnipotent. That's the one. We were just talking in the chat about how thinking's hard, and there you go. That's proof. I had to think, and I couldn't do it. But there are
That's
people...
why I moved from philosophy to computer science for now.
But I mean, even then, people will argue what they mean about these things. You know, for example, omniscience. When you point out certain issues with the omnipotent, they'll say, "Well, no, they can only know everything that there is up until that point. They can't know everything in the future. It's not talking about future all knowledge. It's just." They just know everything that is happening at the time. Some will even say, well, it's not that they're all knowing, it's just that they know more than every other being that's alive. They are the most knowing, and that's what they mean by that. They have, you know, all the knowledge available that is the time, but they don't know everything that could be. There's so many different ways that these things can be played with. So I completely agree with what he's saying there, in the sense that this God thing, even when theists think they're talking about the same concept, they're not necessarily, because I mean that's why there's so many different denominations within Christianity, for example. You know, they're all arguing over these minor little bits. There's no single agreement. We could say the same about the term atheist. There is no agreement in the atheist community on what we should be using about the term atheist. So by Flu's own words, then we should consider atheism meaningless.
Sort of, yeah. I mean, the theist should be approaching the atheist in the same way that Flu suggests the atheist approach the believer here, because atheism is no longer this sort of unitary concept. It now has so many different things, and there's sort of idiosyncratic definitions where people are like, well, I believe atheism is the logical, considered rejection of theistic argument.
Yeah.
There's
So that's what the
individuals...
theist would actually say. So someone says, you know, I'm an atheist. The theist should instantly, instead of going, well, you believe this, they should say, okay, so what do you mean by atheist in this? And then, you know, do the dialogue around that. And we atheists should do the same sort of thing with Christians. or theists in general. If they say, well, I'm a Christian, you think, okay, so I can accept that there's probably the unifying concept of Christians is you believe in Christ and you believe that you should follow his way. But what does, your version of Christianity look like to you? And then you have that conversation with them rather than just assuming because they're a Christian, they believe X, Y, Z.
Yeah. And I mean, an argument can be made here that even the core concepts of like the resurrection, a Christian need not necessarily even believe the resurrection was a real event, because you have somebody like Philip Goff, who is a cultural Christian, so to speak. And he believes in a lot of the values promoted by Christianity. He believes in the rituals and the coming together of the community, but he doesn't necessarily believe in a real physical resurrection.
Yeah. I've also heard another example of the resurrection being it's his spirit rising rather than his physical body as well. So it was just the fact that they saw his soul ascending to heaven, which is another way that it can be done. So yeah, even with some of the core concepts like the resurrection, there is no consistency there. So again, as we were saying, you have to talk to each person and find out what they do and don't believe about their particular position. It's sort of a shame that all of these concepts aren't clearer. It's one of the reasons why I like the specific ontological positions in regards to God's existence, because I can accurately infer what someone does and does not believe about the proposition and the content therein based on these things. But unfortunately, a lot of them have become muddy because that's what language is like, and we're confusing beings. And as Randolph said in the chat earlier, thinking's hard.
Yeah. And I mean, if here's another example for how Christianity isn't some monolithic thing, and you can argue that Islam isn't this monolithic thing either. If you think about something like the Southern Baptist, a lot of them believe in a fire and brimstone version of hell.
Yeah.
But you also have Christian Universalists who believe all will be saved and no one is destined for hell. Or you have annihilationists who believe that there is no lake of fire, there is no torture for eternity, no eternal conscious torment. They just believe that those who believe will be brought up to heaven, and those who don't believe will just fizzle out.
Yep. I've heard different
And
ones of that. Also, those that believe that everyone that will make it there eventually, some via stopping by purgatory. And yeah.
So that's it.
So as you're saying, again, there's no consistent conception of these things.
Yeah, and that's why Flu says here it cannot be taken for granted that even the would-be mainstream theist is operating with a legitimate concept which theoretically could have an application to an actual being. I mean, some of them might, who knows? But you can't assume that everyone's going to have a non-contradictory and coherent conception.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe any of them do, but that's me.
I'm just catching up on the chat. We got some drama in the chat today. No, you carry on. You read. I'm just catching up on the chat. It's quite funny. There is that we're doing a show about one person's rebranding of atheism, and there is a conversation about the definition of atheism going on.
It'll happen when this kind of paper is discussed.
Yeah. OP corrected me on the dinosaur. I knew he'd chime in. It's a Plesiosaurus. That's the one. Thank you.
One.
I knew that it existed somewhere, but all I've got is me reading through the books when I was younger and seeing this picture of this thing that in my head I could only ever remember Water Diplodocus.
Yeah, I can see Loch Ness Monster in my brain and see what it's supposed to look like, but I can never remember the actual species it's supposed to be.
Yeah. So Plesiosaurus. Plesiosaurus. I bet
Excellent.
I'm saying it wrong as well. In fact, it's kind of like a plesiosaurus. Maybe that'll hmm. um yeah. Oh, hey Manny, nice to see you get join the chat as
Hey,
well.
Manny.
Always good for you to be here. But yes, Charlie the Unicorn. Oh my god. Hey Charlie. Oh man, I haven't seen that one for ages. I in relation to the plesiosaurus. Oh guys, yeah, now Luke is trying to get everyone to say Worcester. I've
You
spoiled it
can't
though.
ask Americans to do that.
Yeah, Worcestershire.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny how like these colloquialisms come about though, because they're not exactly wrong with how that word is pronounced. It's just we've just ripped it and taken out the middle chunk of that word. But then, I mean, there's similar ones that Americans have. Like they can't actually say the word herbs; they miss the H. You know, and they add a Y on the end of the word Nike. Why?
Yeah. I mean, I've heard Americans also say things like Glasgow and Edinburgh.
Brilliant.
And don't tell Americans yet, but we only do it once they get the pronunciation right. We just change it just to make it more awkward for them.
Yeah, plus in every little town around the UK, we all speak so differently, we can barely understand each other. So the second you get used to one of our accents, we'll just send you somewhere else. Send you up to Manchester.
No,
Or,
send them to Newcastle.
oh, I was just going to say, or Newcastle. Here, boy, you some
Yeah,
flowers!
why, aye, man, what you on about? It's like the worst of the British accent and the worst of the Scottish accent combined.
Yeah, and I genuinely need a translator to understand most people north of the Thames, to be fair.
Yeah, but that's because you're a Southern shandy drinker.
Yeah, this is true.
Well, I mean, in America, if I remember right, when they started showing EastEnders, they had to put subtitles on it, and the same with Trainspotting. There was subtitles so that Americans could actually get what was being said.
Fair. I mean, to be fair, I have subtitles on most things that I watch. Well, it's probably because I struggle with my sequential audio processing. So if I can read it at the same time, I'm more focused on what's going on. Otherwise, I get really distracted, and I sometimes have to keep rewinding. It's like when I'm reading a book sometimes as well. Actually, if there's any other sort of thing going on, I sometimes read the same page over and over again. So I should really get the audiobook at the same time as reading the book, and maybe that would help me read better as well. I need both.
That might actually.
Yeah.
Just wait till you start reading Kendall Walton. I can spend a day reading one page going, what the fuck is he saying?
In that case, it sounds like I should just wait for the Dave Skinny notes. We had a question from Michael James saying why atheists are mean.
We're not remedial.
I think every human has the ability to be mean. Every human has the ability to be kind, with the exception of any serious psychological issues. I don't think any atheist is inherently mean. I don't think any theist is inherently mean, or any other form of non-theist. I think that they can be. I think on the internet, the behaviors of the most fundamentalist of both theists and atheists come out, and it presents the worst of us, much in the same way that you can see vegan activists, the ones that are holier than thou and get really up in your face about absolutely everything. They're not what the average vegan is like. Most vegans are really cool people, really down to earth, will really chat to you about everything. But on the internet, they will jump all over your ass and they'll be really like, and you're just like, oh. But that's the same. I think the anonymity of the internet goes to further that, because they wouldn't behave like that necessarily with someone in the street, or if you sat down and have a conversation with these people, they would change their manner. So I just think that maybe, the internet is probably terrible for a lot of these sorts of conversations.
It removes immediate repercussions. So.
Exactly.
And I mean, the thing with atheists is it's like any other group. They're made up of humans. Humans have a huge range of psychological predispositions. And so in every group, you will get from one end of the spectrum to the other. It's just generally within our own in-group, we will tend to overlook the worst while seeing the worst in other groups.
Exactly. I mean, that as you say, in group, I mean, that's just appealing to our tribal nature, and humans are still very, very tribal creatures. We look after our own, and we fear, reject, hate anything that's a little bit different. So, as you say, you'll look at the worst of the others, you will other everyone, and you'll sort of ignore a lot of the shit, and even maybe back up the shit from your own group. The other thing that does happen sometimes, though, when someone who is in the in group says something slightly different to the rest of the in group, they might get othered too and pushed out.
Yeah.
Dave and I quite often don't go with the standard atheist consensus on a lot of things, so we're assumed that we're theists, but we believe gods don't exist.
Yeah.
It's just like, right.
I got tired of being called the theist troll, which is why I don't really get in discussions with a lot of other atheists these days.
I don't blame you.
Okay, so back to the paper. I've skipped over a little bit. And in that bit, what he's discussing is the reasons that we were just discussing about different beliefs, different things, and how different theists have different ideas about God's power, control, how he created things, and all that kind of stuff, is why we shouldn't take for granted what the theist believes or that they have a coherent thing.
Mm.
And then he moves on to argue the general reason why this presumption of atheism matters is that its acceptance must put the whole question of the existence of God into an entirely fresh perspective. So, in other words, by taking this approach and saying, define your God first, we're looking at it in a completely different way. And it's sort of general practice to do that these days and has been for quite a while. But at that time, it was mostly just presumed that it was like the God of Christian theism being spoken about. And we can sort of infer that from whatever the theist is, but we can only assume a base amount of information from that.
Yeah.
So like the God of classical theism and then built on.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, which makes sense. I mean, you would, especially if you're in a particular country where there is a country's belief. I mean, it's quite often said that like we're a Christian country, so if someone mentions God in this country, you'd probably assume that they're talking about, the Christian God. But I agree with, as you say, it's par for the course now. It tends to be the way we go about things. But I agree that that's what we should be doing, is actually trying to spend more time at the beginning of the conversation working out what they mean by God and what their beliefs are surrounding their God, the justifications for their God. Not just simply go, burden of proof, have a conversation, work it out what they're saying, then go, okay. And then see which points you think maybe sound good and some bits which maybe don't sound so good, and address each of those in a calm and rational way and try and progress the conversation. Or, do you know what? If you're not actually prepared to have a proper conversation, don't discuss the whole God thing at all.
Yeah, I mean, there's better things you could be doing with your time, like getting involved in groups that argue for the separation of church and state. If that's your problem, go with that,
Yeah.
or go with trying to make sure that, you know, creationism isn't taught in schools. Join those kind of movements, because you'll be having a more positive effect by doing that than you will by just going on the internet and picking a fight.
Mm-hmm.
And picking that fight might make the Christian or the Muslim or whatever double down
Yeah.
and become more kind of convinced that they need to have Christianity in schools. So you might be doing more harm than good by going online and going, well, you're a fucking idiot. Show me your proof. Show me your proof.
Yeah.
And, you know, if the whole point is to remove the problem, don't create more problems.
Yep.
And Flu makes a good point here that if we look at it this way, and we start putting it in this light, and we start getting them to go over their concepts, we might be able to point out the conceptual problems.
Mm-hmm. I mean,
And
equally as we said, you know, you build a rapport with someone, they're more likely to listen to you. If you're not just attacking them and you're having a conversation, they might be more willing to consider, you know.
exactly.
Oh, right. Oh, I hadn't thought about that. Let me go and think on that. You might stop and have that conversation and come back a day later, a couple of days later, and it'll continue.
Yeah, exactly. And like we've mentioned many times, if somebody doesn't respect you, they're not going to listen to you. Like, let's take William Lane Craig, for example. Okay. I can respect that he is a good philosopher. I know he's got a PhD. I know he knows his arguments. He knows terms, definitions. He knows logic. And so I can admit that his arguments are logically valid. Now, a lot of atheists don't respect him at all, and they'll just disregard anything he says as bad.
Yeah.
Just reject it because it's William Lane Craig. I mean, it's a genetic fallacy, but they'll just reject it because they have no respect. And you'll find the same with a lot of theists who'll do that with atheist philosophers. Well, he's an atheist. He's obviously a fool. The fool has said there is no God, you know, that kind of stuff.
Yep.
So respect matters.
Very much so.
Okay. And Flu then goes on to say that one of the things, one of the kind of positives about this is that it forces the theist who wants to build a thorough apologetic, it forces them to begin from the beginning again. And each atheist might have a different perspective on that concept. So if they have to start from the beginning again, like if you think about the discussion we had last week, Philip had ideas that I just hadn't thought of.
Mm-hmm.
And so he brought a different perspective to what was being said. Now, if each atheist did this, it would create more and more, or show more and more problems within the concept itself,
Yeah.
simply because that's the way it works. Different people might have different ideas. But if the whole idea is always just, well, I'm not convinced. Why aren't you convinced? Well, I'm just not convinced. You're not attacking the concept. You're not showing any problems with it. You're just saying, well, I don't believe you.
Yeah.
This is why. And I mean, these people are following kind of the idea that Flu is putting behind, but they're skipping all the important parts of what Flu was arguing.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting what the focus has been that's come out of things since his paper, and the bits that have been latched onto and the bits that have just been discounted almost. It makes me wonder, well, why, how, and all of these things, you know. Perhaps it's because some of it is much cognitively easier to just go, oh, it's meaningless, but without actually having the conversation.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And I suppose in part, I blame this whole idea that's become popular since the early 2010s that religion is only worthy of ridicule. Belief in God is only worthy of ridicule. Because it's taken away that ethos of arguing why it's bad.
Mm.
And it's taken away the idea that we should be showing these incoherencies in the concepts when that's exactly what we should be doing.
Yeah. No question from me there.
Yeah. So Flew then goes on to discuss why the atheist should remain neutral. And it's because of he's going to use the kind of courtroom analogy that has become popular these days. I'll just wait for you to finish.
No. I'm just responding in the chat. I suppose as you've done there. So Bearded Heretic says you have subtitles, but you're dyslexic. Yeah, I'm dyslexic, but I also suffer with sequential audio processing and memory. So it means that I've basically got ear dyslexia as well as eye dyslexia. So attacking my senses on both counts so that I can hear and see the words helps me better, because as I was saying, when I read a book I can read the same bit over and over and over again, but if I'm just listening to something, I don't always stay on point. I also have ADHD, so I'm very prone to distraction. So if I have both audio and visual engaging me, then there's more chance of me picking things up. So hopefully that explains that to you. Basically, my brain's fucked. There's been quite a few comments coming through the chat, but most of the time they're just talking amongst themselves. So it's nice to see you all enjoying such a good conversation. But LB asks a question saying, as atheism is huge in the UK, is it more relaxed than over there? I wouldn't say atheism is huge exactly. I'd say that religion just isn't a big deal over here. We don't have the same troubles. Now, it's funny because I actually went to Christian schools. I said the Lord's Prayer every day, sung hymns and did all of that sort of stuff. And there are certain bits of religious influence in places, but it's nothing like you see in America. There aren't creationism being taught in schools and things like that. There isn't the obfuscation of scientific fact for religious belief. They're just there is even though we don't have a separation of church and state in the way that it's supposed to be in America, it sort of naturally happened that way. Part of that's probably because Church of England is just relaxed in and of itself in a way. It's a bit more of a wishy-washy take on Christianity, and that's the more prominent one in the UK. I mean, what actually got me into discussing these concepts online was actually meeting a creationist in the UK. Absolutely lovely guy. But I just found it so strange that there were people that had this belief, because I had never met a young earth creationist or even heard of young earth creationism. So at that age, I sort of jumped onto the internet and was like, what the hell is this? And suddenly there was all this fundamentalist religiosity that sort of blew my mind away. And I did become a bit of a keyboard warrior myself when I first started these conversations, because I couldn't believe how, well, ridiculous a lot of these concepts seemed. Like the general theistic concepts, I don't have any problem with, but there's some which are just so devoid of rationality that I felt like I had to try and correct them. But I didn't do it in the best way. It's probably why I try and stay out of a lot of theistic debate anyway. I don't really care what someone believes as long as they're not doing any harm to anyone else. So it doesn't really bother me if you're a theist or an atheist or some other form of non-theist, as long as you're not hurting anybody. What does it matter?
It's the content of your character that counts.
Definitely.
Which is why I have a lot of problems with a lot of other atheists. It's the content of the character I'm concerned with.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, the content of the beliefs are important as well because they influence the content of the character. But it's not necessarily the belief in God that gives bad character. It's the beliefs about what God wants that gives the bad character.
Yeah. Yeah. You lived on Downs Road. What's that from? I might have just missed something in the chat. I'm trying to skim through, just come up to any of the questions or anything that's happened in there. Oh, you're having a chat with Maverick. So you lived very close to each other, and you probably had a house party. It is a small world. It is a small world. I mean, to be honest, Luke, Bearded Heretic is from what's it called? Kent. You said in the chat, which is only just over from where I am now. Manny says Anthony Flew is the one that became a theist, right? He became a deist, which I would agree
Deist,
is
yeah.
a form of theism because it's a belief in God. It's not classical theism, but I would argue that deism is a form of theism because they're believing in a supernatural being. But yes.
Yeah, if I remember right, it was something along the lines of the contingency argument mixed with the design argument that sort of convinced him.
Yeah, fair. How long's the contingency argument been around?
Quite a while. Aquinas had a kind of version of it.
Fair. Just wondering because I always find it odd when someone in their later life has this change of heart. You'd have expected someone like Flew to have been quite aware of these things, especially if you're sort of making a case for something like atheism and he's a philosopher. You'd have expected him to have a bit more knowledge of the things like the contingency argument. So, which is why I was wondering: is it actually a relatively new argument? Is it something that's only appeared in the last 20 years, and that's why he didn't know of it back then?
It's become stronger over time, over the last few decades. Like it's been refined and stuff and been taken a bit more seriously, but they all come under the header of like a cosmological argument. And there's all different versions of the cosmological argument.
Yeah. Sorry, catching up on the stats about atheism in the UK. Apparently, only 9% identified as atheists, but 32% described themselves as non-religious. Whether that means that they were non-religious believers or non-religious non-believers, we don't know. But that's the 2011 census. In fact, we should be getting the results of the recent one, or has that come out and I've completely missed it?
I've not seen the results yet.
Oh, it was only the end of March.
We still have census people coming around the neighborhood knocking on doors. So
Oh, really? So they haven't even collated the results. I wonder what that will be. It seemed a little bit more specific this time. Though I did find it odd that they asked me for the religion of my 1-year-old daughter. I don't know if she believes in God. Fuck. She might.
yeah.
Kids are inherently irrational.
That's just mean.
I know. And I don't honestly believe that. I just figured I'd chuck it out there as a bit of a joke. Yeah, as Bearded Heretic says, the UK has a lot of underlying religious aspects to it, which are starting to become problematic. They can be in certain areas. Yeah. I mean, there even are still, even in schools, there are some state schools that still, so obviously in the private schools, if you send someone to a private school and it happens to be a religious private school, or even if it's a church-funded school, then you can expect there to be the churchiness to it. But there are some state schools which obviously have a religious principal or headmaster that sort of try and enforce things on there. So you do get some of that sort of stuff coming in. And also, I think within politics, there are some still outdated, bigoted views that are inspired by religion on things like marriage and homosexuality and things like that. I mean, there is still a problem, but it's not a big problem. It's not a big issue. There's stuff coming through, but at the end of the day, you tend not to get into a conversation. Like when I lived in America, and I said, I told someone that I didn't believe in any gods or anything like that and didn't have a religion. I was told I had to believe in something. It could be anything, but I had to have a belief. It was just completely irrational to not believe in gods and things like that. And it was that there was this massive attitude. And in the end, I told them I was a Wiccan, and apparently that was more satisfactory than being an atheist. Which I don't fully understand why, because their Bible says that you should not suffer a witch to live. So surely it should have caused more hate, but it didn't. Chris also says in Sweden, the atheism isn't even a movement and almost not even theism. It's hard to find open believers, perhaps the only from the Muslim community, though. That's really interesting. So basically, non-theism or atheism, whatever it is, in Sweden is the more common one there. That's really, really, really interesting. Yeah, so I mean, get back to the statistics one. Randolph says it's not uncommon for a theist to not follow or practice a religion. I mean, there are quite more and more secular theists, especially in the forms of deists. That's why I think that there is a difference between believing in gods and having a religion. There are also atheistic religions. Some forms of Buddhism, Church of Satan, Satanic Temple, all of them either don't believe in gods or actually believe gods do not exist. So, or they have a slightly different take on it. I know there's some forms of Buddhism that might have more of a theistic style belief to it. So, asking about religion doesn't necessarily tell you if someone believes in a deity or not. It's quite a difficult one there.
I mean, if Opie would know better than me, but I think Shinto in Japan is a godless religion as well. It's more about ghosts and spirits and things like that.
Sorry, say again?
Opie would know better than me.
Yeah.
But if I'm remembering correctly, you have Shinto in Japan, and that's more about the worship of ancestors and ghosts and spirits and things like that. I think it's an actual godless religion.
Isn't that the same with Native American religions? They don't actually necessarily have a deity as such, but they have spirits and stuff as well. I can't actually speak from much experience on that one, so if anyone wants to correct me, they can. But I believe that there wasn't, the gods as such. It was the spirits and the forefathers, and much in the same way as you were describing there. But then again, I mean, there could have been different takes on that as well. Randolph says, if the contingency argument is true, then it would have to be timeless and therefore never not been around. Cafe says, the normalizing atheist movement constantly complains religion is harmless beyond the content of one's character. They're worried about theists getting religious-inspired laws passed legislation. I don't know what you mean exactly by that. It depends on the types of people and how they take their beliefs. There are certain characters that do get weaponized. We can see that there are definite harms done by the people trying to enforce religious beliefs in certain areas. There are certain parts of the world where homosexuals and atheists are killed just for being homosexuals and atheists. So you can't say that there is no harm done, but I think in general, if we're just talking about the average person with their religious beliefs, it's more about their character, because I think most people tend to be quite good. For the, they might have some beliefs that I don't agree with, but they might not necessarily be harmful beliefs. But like Luke was saying in the chat, there are marches and protests going on about non-heterosexual not reproduction, sex, non-heterosexual sex being taught in schools, which I personally don't see a problem with. I think everybody should understand how all these different things work. At the end of the day, they're probably not getting them to act it out themselves, just like in your sex education when you were younger. But there would be people protesting these things for religious reasons. At the end of the day, I think that sex education helps people not fuck up as badly. You can see that the highest areas with things like teenage pregnancy are the areas where they don't have proper sex education, and you could imagine the same sort of thing with STIs and things like that. So why? And it's also exclusive. I mean, there are homosexuals. We should normalize homosexuality. I know it largely is normalized in day-to-day culture. There's so much on diversity and inclusion done within works for trans rights, gay rights, etc. But there is still, especially with the older generation, a lot of resistance, and some of that resistance comes through religion, and some of it just comes from being old and bigoted.
Yeah. And I mean, going back to the sex education thing, teaching about homosexuality and homosexual sex in a sex ed class isn't exactly going to turn people gay. It's something that's innate.
Yeah. Going into a coffee shop didn't turn me into a barista.
No, exactly.
In fact, I worked in one for a month and was asked to leave. So even working in one didn't turn me into a barista.
What were you using to draw the pictures on the coffee?
You know me too well. Sorry, Dave. Carry on. I'm almost caught
That's
up
all right.
on the chat.
No worries. Okay, so Flew then goes on to argue about his presumption of atheism some more, and he mentions that there's a confusion about possible varieties of proof, and he goes on to describe how these can be resolved. And he mentions that it's frequently said nowadays that everybody knows that it's impossible to prove the existence of God, even by professing Roman Catholics. And that an objection to this is that it's part of essential dogma of Roman Catholicism, as defined by the First Vatican Council, that the one and true God, our Creator and Lord, can be known for certain through the creation by the natural light of human reason. So when people argue that it's impossible to prove or disprove God, there are religions and believers and things that argue that it is possible to prove that God exists. So if it's possible to prove that God exists, it's possible to prove that he doesn't. Depending on the concept.
Yeah. No, well, I think as you say, depending on the concept, there are some concepts, as we discussed earlier, that are so logically impossible that they are incoherent, and therefore we can say that they don't exist. But I've not found anything convincing enough to suggest one does.
Yeah. And I mean, I know that there's the whole, well, it's a metaphysical being, therefore you can't use physical sciences to prove it. But most people who understand these arguments know that, okay, you can prove that God didn't have a hand in certain things by examining those certain things. Like the Genesis story can't be a true account because we know how the things. I mean, you could argue that it doesn't necessarily prove that this God doesn't exist, but for those who believe that Genesis is a literal kind of description, you can then say, well, I know your version of that God does not exist.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, but most theists who discuss this stuff are using arguments.
Hmm.
And I know there's the whole arguments don't prove anything. The map is not the territory. Show me the physical evidence. Well, you're making a misunderstanding of the arguments, and arguing stuff like that isn't necessarily going to further the discussion or convince the person that the arguments are bad.
Yeah. Yeah. Just address them.
Yeah,
It's the problem with the word proof, though. Generally, when people hear the word proof, they mean conclusive evidence, and they think about evidence in the scientific realm. But when we're talking about, the burden of proof or epistemic justification, it's more addressing the arguments and justifying your position in a rational way.
yeah.
So,
And
what leads you to this conclusion? And there could be some argument that you might find one day that you can't actually defeat that argument.
yeah,
And saying, that's when I tend to find that falls back on as well. Like, well, that's just an argument. That's not real proof. It's like, okay, but address the argument. Tell me what's wrong with that particular argument.
yeah.
And then maybe you'll get them to realize there's a problem with their argument. And all of a sudden, maybe they'll have something else, or maybe you'll have convinced them or got them thinking about it a little bit more.
That's it. And that's the important thing, is getting people thinking. If you just say, well, no physical evidence equals no God, you're not getting them thinking beyond anything other than, well, he just doesn't understand epistemology.
Mm.
And I mean, Flew goes on here, and this is kind of what makes me laugh, is a lot of modern atheists are sort of using this bastardized version of what Flew was arguing. But even Flew says here, it is therefore worth underlining that when the presumption of atheism is explained as insisting that the onus of proof must be on the theist. I'm sorry, I've got a hell of a tickle in my throat tonight.
No.
The word proof is being used in the ordinary wide sense in which it can embrace any and every variety of sufficient reason,
Yeah.
which means arguments and reasons for believing and things like that. So when the atheist who's sort of subscribing to Flu's position turns around and says, well, arguments aren't justification, well, they're arguing against Flu.
Yeah. I mean, that's basically what we're talking about here with the proof, though, isn't it? We're talking about, in a more a wider sense, justification, and that is how proof can be used. I mean, if
Yep.
you are speaking purely of wanting conclusive evidence, then I mean, honestly, think about some really mundane things in your life, right? You come to a bridge and you go, should I cross it? And you go, generally, you're only going to cross that bridge if you believe that the bridge will take your weight. Well, why do you want that bridge to take your weight? You have no proof in the strictest sense of the word that this bridge will definitely take your weight. It might have taken your weight before. I mean, that's induction. You might have a knowledge of bridge construction. You know that the purpose of bridges is to take the weight of objects going over it. You know that you're incredibly light in comparison to the things that go over it. But hey, for all you know, something has happened that's weakened the structural integrity of the bridge. And the second you cross over it, it happens to collapse. In this particular circumstance, you've got no proof, in the strict sense of the word, that it is not going to collapse under your weight. All you have is good arguments and induction and things like that. And that is generally how a lot of these things work in day-to-day life.
Yeah. Most people run on reasons rather than physical evidence or, like conclusive evidence. There's something called the closure principle of knowledge, which is sort of when can we ever get to a thing that closes it off and doesn't go on forever as sort of justifications. But most people, when you go for a bus, I use this one a lot, I know, but when you go for a bus, you look at the timetable, that's just evidence that the bus is supposed to get there at around some time, but it's not evidence that the bus will get there at that time, nor is it evidence that the bus will even arrive. We just use reasons to say, well, it should do. So I'm going to go to the bus stop 5 minutes before in case it gets here early because I have experience with buses coming early. It's reason rather than physical evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So next, Flew comes to his courtroom analogy. And we hear this one a lot in the atheist community, that they're not accusing God of being guilty of not existing. They're just saying he's not guilty of existing.
Yeah. I always found that one to be a little bit funny in itself. I understand how sort of the inferences you can get from it, but yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things he says is that there's an analogy between these two presumptions that we can have justifications and justifications can be proved. One element of that is that both of those things are defeasible. We can come up with counter arguments, we can show incoherencies, like you mentioned before. And that's the point of getting them to go through their definition of God. Because we can say they're guilty of not existing if we actually go through the proofs and evidences provided.
Fair.
Um, so, blah, 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 blah. The presumption of innocence indicates where the court should start and how it must proceed. Yet the prosecution is still able, more often than not, to bring forward what is in the end accepted as sufficient reason to warrant the verdict guilty. Which appropriate sufficient reason is properly characterized as proof of guilt. Now, a lot of atheists will argue it needs to be physical evidence. But even in a court, circumstantial evidence can be brought together by a good argument which shows that the person is guilty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
Like
mean,
he was witnessed.
I was just going to
Sorry.
say testimony. So you're saying it's got eyewitnesses, testimony. It's not necessarily strong physical evidence by any stretch of the imagination. At the end of the day, it's people giving anecdotes of what they saw.
Yeah. And most people on a jury aren't scientists or forensic psychologists or forensic scientists. They can only go by what is argued by the expert testimony. And they'll take that on board and kind of process it and then come up with an argument for why they either don't find it convincing or find the person guilty.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
that's Blue's idea for this. It doesn't necessarily need to be this kind of rock solid evidence or physical evidence. Reason and justification, the epistemic justifications can be arguments. They might not be convincing, but we should also be able to argue for why we don't find it convincing.
Mm.
I know in court, you don't necessarily, as a member of the jury, have to say, this is why I find him not guilty. But you have a different obligation in discourse than you do as a member of a jury.
Mm.
And if you want to convince somebody of why you find their God not guilty of existing, you need to put forward these arguments.
Yeah, I mean, you could also say if you're part of a jury and you all have different opinions, so you're essentially in a hung jury and you don't want to go to a mistrial, you are going to try and discuss things with each other anyway. And why do you think innocence, and why do you think guilt, and or why do you think there isn't enough to convict guilt? And they're going to have that onus. I did a courtroom analogy to try and explain why we should be able to justify our position. Um, so it wasn't exactly a real life court one, but it was talking about the jury. You you don't want the jury to convict someone of guilt or innocence, or should I say guilt or not guilt, simply because not enough evidence. Well, why? It just didn't convince me. Well, what about it didn't convince you? Just didn't feel it, man. Don't seem right. Didn't meet the burden of proof. There's a bit more to the deliberation, or at least you'd hope there's a bit more to the deliberation, especially in some places where they still have things like the death penalty. Yeah, whatever, they seem guilty. Fuck it. What makes you think they're deserving of the death penalty then? They just seem like a bit of a dick. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
You want a bit more thought behind it. That's the way I'd see it anyway.
Well, and that's the thing. In the deliberation process, when the jury goes off to kind of give the verdict, there is argument within that deliberation between the jurors for why they take the position they do. The handing over of the verdict comes after, like you say, deliberation and discussion and arguments among themselves. It isn't just, let's go out and vote him not guilty. And the thing is when you say, I don't believe you, you're already saying, I'm not convinced.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say, when somebody says, well, why don't you believe me? And you say, well, I'm just not convinced. You're not really saying anything except the same thing again.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's one of the disappointing things when you see on the internet where someone goes, well, I'm an atheist because I'm not convinced by the evidence. It's worse when they say there's no evidence, but when they say I'm not convinced by the evidence, and you go, well, okay, that's fine as an opening, but what is unconvincing to you? And that's the bit I think a lot of us are missing in the community, especially online, when we're having these discussions on places like Twitter or Facebook debate groups or anything like that. It's not just that you're not convinced. Just tell us why it didn't convince you. What about this evidence is uncompelling? What about this argument? I mean, Dave and I did an entire stream on why we held the belief gods don't exist. We're happy to provide our arguments. We try and actually stay away from the general, theistic arguments these days. As I said earlier, we sort of don't really care, as long as you're not hurting anyone. But if you want us to talk about it, we can, and we did address it in a stream. It's just kind of bad when you do see some atheists saying that sort of thing, and you try and find out what their reasons are. Because sometimes there might be something I haven't thought about, and maybe it's another tool for my belt. It's always good to have these conversations and maybe check your own biases. There are times when I've put stuff forward and it's been pointed out to me that it's not a strong argument as I first thought. Okay, I have to think on it more. Great, it's made me think. I mean, I know thinking's hard. We all find thinking hard. Causes us to have a lot of headaches, and but it's good to do.
Well, here's another thing about this courtroom analogy, and you raise a good point, checking your biases at the door. Now, Flew argues that we should come to the proposition and the argument without any kind of presumptions beyond, I don't have any thoughts on this thing until you lay it out in front of me.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a lot of them a lot of the people who follow this and use the courtroom analogy will come to those discussions with a lot of presumptions, like evidence must be physical, evidence must be testable, evidence must be repeatable. All gods are false, all gods are imaginary. Now, that betrays what Flew is attempting to argue here, because he's saying, come to it not with any of those presumptions, but just with the presumption that it's up to them to make their case.
Hmm. Yeah.
If you come to it, imagine a jury that, or like, okay, here's an example that might be a bit triggering, but think of 1950s America, an all-white jury and a black person accused of something. A lot of them will come to it with sort of biases because of the time. Well, he's black, he's obviously something wrong with him, that kind of stuff.
You still get those sorts of biases today. Not as bad, but there are still those biases today.
Exactly. Well, if he's black, he must have committed a crime. He should have, that kind of stuff. Blacks are more prone to crime. None of those things are true. But if the defense lawyer was good and he found out that you came with those biases, he could argue that the trial was unfair because you didn't come with the presumption of innocence. You came with the presumption that he was guilty.
Hmm.
And so when you use Flu's argument and you come with the idea that all gods are imaginary, you're already betraying what Flu is trying to argue here.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Oh, it definitely does. I mean, I like his method. I don't necessarily agree that the way I prefer to define atheism, I don't necessarily think I'd necessarily regard it as a form of atheism. But the method he uses is a good method. So, regardless of the ontological position, I think anyone can use this method and should use this method for any sort of claim. Start at the beginning, leave your biases at the door, and actually just say, right, let's have a conversation about this. Make your case. Right. Start with your initial premises, provide your arguments to support this premise, and tear it down bit by bit if you need to. Ask questions, have a conversation. So yeah, regardless of whether you want to call it an atheist or not, I mean, that bit is kind of irrelevant. He uses negative atheism for this, but I think even the positive atheist in his world should still use this method for the conversations. But yeah. No, I like it though.
Absolutely. Yeah. He raises a lot of really good points. And I mean, here he's saying that if you start with positive atheism, you're already starting with this conclusion that God does not exist. And it also starts with the theist being able to say, well, what is your proof? What is your... They can start from the presumption of theism and say, what is your proof for this? So with his method, you're starting with this thing where the theist can't turn around and say, where is your proof for your stance? Because you haven't actually taken a stance until they've laid out their case in front of you.
Yeah, which makes sense.
Which is one of the reasons, it's one of the reasons why he wanted to change atheism to this non-committal kind of approach. Well, atheism is just taking an approach that you are not just not convinced, but you start from the position that nobody else has convinced you so far, but let's have a look at what you're arguing. But again, I generally tend to go with the God does not exist kind of version for atheism. But even those who argue now that atheism is just being without belief in gods are sort of kind of springboarding off Flu's idea, but only taking that and sort of bastardizing a lot of the things he argues. without fully understanding it. And it's probably because none of this actually gets mentioned in the atheist community. Just really simple ideas from it mixed in with a kind of scientism.
Yeah, I do think the scientism side of things is a big problem within the atheist community anyway. This sort of almost deifying science and, you know, giving it the ultimate epistemic power and treating it as if it is perfect, essentially making the omni-god out of science.
Yeah.
And you're just like, no, science is great, especially only for really investigating the physical natural world. It's not really for the metaphysical unless you've got an argument that the metaphysical is affecting the physical in some way. But yeah.
And here's something to mention. I know we discussed the empathetic atheist on the last stream, but here's something to mention. A lot of atheists are kind of giving him grief for his approach. But if you think about his approach, he has done exactly what Flew has argued in this paper. He started from the presumption that he was unsure whether they could meet their burden. He began with them laying out all their apologetics and then made a verdict after hearing all the apologetics. So he did what Flew argued.
Yeah. And fair play to him. I mean, it is...
Yeah.
Whilst I don't agree with his new ontological position, I can applaud the fact that he changed his mind, that he actually took an honest approach with it. It shows that, you know, he was an honest guy. He still is an honest guy.
Yeah.
And that's more than I can say for many that I've had conversations with. I've had he's actually contacted us since we did that video and said thank you because he appreciates that we didn't attack him. So yeah, no, it was nice. Hopefully we can have him on for a chat and find his side, find out how the drama's all going, and find out the arguments that convinced him the most from his words. Be quite an interesting stream to have.
And dispel this idea from a lot of atheists that it was just the column that convinced him, or just the contingency argument that convinced him.
Yeah. It's never just one argument. I mean, as we said last Thursday, it's never just one argument.
No, exactly. It's a collection of arguments that all make sense and come together.
Yeah, exactly. It's think about it like building a house. It's not just one brick that you can live in. It's the combination of all the bricks going around to at least make a small shack.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot more to go with this paper, obviously. And we could do it another point, but this is basically what a lot of contemporary atheists are taking from this paper and sort of getting wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Should we switch back to the normal mode, or is there anything else you wanted to cover off quickly?
Oh, no, that's enough to get the idea of what Flew was arguing and the differences. And it's mostly what I wanted to discuss about the difference between what atheism has become and using Flew's ideas and what Flew was arguing himself.
No, thank you for that. I really enjoyed it. But let's quickly switch back then. And we're back in the room.
How's it going?
Yeah, good. No, that's
it's sort of drawn on so much there, but
no, I enjoyed it. It's quite interesting looking at the way that a lot of us atheists have taken these sorts of ideas and sort of changed how they ought to be understood. And I suppose in a way it's something we all do. We've oversimplified what was actually being said. We've taken the fact that he's arguing for, you know, a form of non-theism to be regarded as atheism, and you know, to address the concept, but unfortunately it's become, well, I only lack a belief, and I don't have to justify my position. Whereas here's like, well, it's not that you don't have to justify your position. You can start with saying, well, you know, I don't accept any of these claims. I don't understand. Nothing's convinced me up to now. What do you mean by God? Tell me about your God. And then having the conversation. And that's the way it should be anyway. Even if you believe gods don't exist, you should try and approach the conversation without any of your biases. But especially if you're sitting in that position where you're saying you only lack belief, you should be more in that state where, okay, tell me about your God. Let you know. Tell me what you mean by God. Tell me how you define God. Okay. And then going, right, can you see there's this problem with this? This is why I don't accept your definition, and going through it. Now, maybe it can be tiring. Maybe it's exhausting to actually have these conversations. But if you're actually interested in these sorts of conversations or changing a mind or anything like that, why would you engage in conversations where you're just going to be a stonewall and not have a conversation? Think about times when you've been convinced of something else, when someone's managed to actually effectively change your mind. Did they stonewall you, or did they listen to you and maybe walk you through their thoughts and maybe address a few of the points that you've made and have you go, ah. And that's one of the reasons I think, like, the Socratic method, not just like that street epistemology style, but the actual Socratic method where you break down what someone's, you know, they've got. So you've got your parameters, then you break down everything about it, and you make them realize that maybe they didn't quite understand as much as they thought they did, but then build them back up trying to find some form of truth in it. And as we saw with Amino, you know, you might end up in a situation where you both go, well, neither of us know enough about this topic, we're going to have to go do some research. But that's definitely better than just going, not evidence.
Nope. Yeah. And here's the thing as well, if you think about it, Flew was arguing for it to be changed to something like without belief in
Yep.
God. But he was still defining it in terms of a stance on, even though he's not taking a position on God itself, he's just saying, I don't have a belief in God. I don't believe in God. He was still describing a form of stance, not just describing atheism as a mental state.
Yeah. I mean, it was still a response to theism. It was a psychological state, but at the same time, a response to theism. It wasn't just having that lack of belief or being without belief. It was being without belief because there isn't a consistent, coherent definition, and you're willing to listen to the theist to move forward. So it's not quite what a lot of people say it was.
Yeah.
It's
both a psychological state and a methodological stance.
Yeah.
So for him, a baby wouldn't be a negative atheist because the baby isn't also taking that methodological stance. They might be without belief, but that stance is also missing.
Yeah.
And rocks definitely wouldn't be.
What do you mean?
Yeah. I don't know who I'm referring to there. I just made it up on the top of my head.
Yeah, I've had a couple of those conversations come back in. Guys, did any of you have any questions? The chat's got pretty long, and I've tried to skim through it, but you know, my ability to read that plus the screen plus listen to Dave isn't great. So if you do have any questions or comments, now's the time to get them in.
Always go with the chat. They're far more interesting than I am.
Bearded Heretic says, you did not drone on, Dave.
Well, thank you, Luke.
And Chesh says, yeah, have a conversation instead of shutting down a conversation. Yeah, you're damn right. I mean, that's
Absolutely, Chesh.
100%. That's what we need to do. Luke also says, oh my God, yes, babies are not atheists. I mean, we'd agree with you on that. I can understand how under certain definitions you could regard them as it. So I do understand how people got to that place, but I think up until recent years, it has always been, atheism has always been a response to theism. And babies cannot respond to theism. Their consciousness doesn't even start to form until they're like 5 months old, really. And it goes on until they're like 3 and plus their critical thinking skills and brain development doesn't really come in until much later in their lives. So yeah, I mean, it's just arguments about default state. There was sorry,
carry on.
I was just going to say, when I was looking through the etymology and uses of atheism, there was that argument from Bradlaugh, or however it's pronounced, Broudloff or something, who was basically suggesting an agnostic position, and rather than for atheism. That's what he was saying atheism should be defined as. That was in the late 1800s, and he then said, and that's why babies are atheists, because God is a meaningless concept. And therefore, it's meaningless to babies, so therefore they're atheists. By that, then you sort of, I still don't agree, because he's weighed up what God is to be a meaningless concept, and the baby has not weighed it up. So I don't agree, but I can also understand that conclusion from it. But yeah, it's very, very rare. I mean, that was the first time I found anyone suggesting babies were atheist in the English language. I'm not sure if it was suggested before that. I couldn't really see much of that being a suggestion after that as well, apart from obviously recent internet times where it's been suggested. So it's quite interesting how these concepts have changed and evolved over time. And yeah, I've got this article about the etymology versus use/definition of atheism being released tomorrow. And if anyone does happen to read it and notices any gaps where I need to add something in or remove something or tweak something or can send me a link, please do. I mean, this is going to be probably one of those ongoing pieces. I thought I'd completed it a couple of days ago, and then Dave found an article by Nathan Alexander, which was great. It had loads of detail in it that I hadn't even considered or known about. But what it did demonstrate was, from the moment atheism came into the country from the French in the 1500s, up until the late 1800s, it was denial or disbelief in God or gods, which was like, right, okay. And the first use of absence of belief in gods I saw was in 1948, if I'm remembering the article correctly. Yeah. So it was like, wow, okay. So we can see there's different changes over time. We can see that people have always been discussing this sort of thing. And yeah, in general, it has been considered a response to theism. But especially in recent times, it's not regarded as that by many atheists. And I think the more important thing is the content under the label. I think the label has actually become almost meaningless, because we don't know what someone does or doesn't think about it, because it's become so muddy. So we almost, if we're not going to address specific ontological positions, maybe we should just actually have the conversation. Forget the Christian or whatever. Do you think a God exists? Yes, no. Okay, why? Let's go with that.
Yeah.
Fuck all the labels. Let's just have a conversation. And if at the end of it you want to conclude, well, based on your patterns, in my schema, you would be regarded as this, fine. You've now categorized them in a way that makes sense to you, and you know what they do and don't believe, but they don't have to adhere to your label.
Yeah. And I mean, one thing I've heard about this whole atheism is the default state and babies are born atheist stuff is that it's pushback against theists arguing that babies are born believers. Now, an even easier pushback is to say, well, if theism is the affirmation of the proposition God exists, how many babies do you know that can affirm that?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm with you. I think we're generally preaching to the choir, though, aren't we?
Yeah, true.
Although Computer Brain says, I think my pet rock is a vegan. Well, it doesn't eat meat.
I mean, it makes the same kind of sense to me as saying babies are atheists and rock are atheists. Yeah.
I mean, they don't have a digestive system. They don't eat at all. So what's the point of talking about it in terms of things like that? I know you're joking, obviously, Computer Brain, but that's just it. Why talk about things in terms that don't make sense for that particular creature? I can't fly. So we wouldn't talk about me in terms of, unless we're being metaphorical, about me flapping my wings and flying away. Yeah. Apparently the Rock looks at him funny when he eats. Maverick, how do you account for the emergence of consciousness from lifeless matter without prior consciousness? You can flip that one back on yourself. How do you account for an initial consciousness? There's a lot that we don't know about life, but if you think about even a physicalist approach can explain the emergence of consciousness. It puts it in purely physical terms, which I don't 100% agree with, but can understand. And there wasn't consciousness in early life. These early cells that came about. In fact, there isn't much consciousness on the planet that is as developed as ours. In fact, I think Luke's probably better to have this conversation, considering his degrees are in this stuff. But yeah, if you think about how everything built on everything, so your single-celled organisms into more and more and more, and everything got progressively more complex over time, and probably part of an evolutionary survival trait to continue surviving, we had to develop these consciousnesses that helped us reason and become self-aware. Now, I don't have all the answers in this field. We don't fully understand consciousness yet. So I can't give you that answer, but I wouldn't personally fill that gap with a god. But I can understand if you do.
It sounds more like he's arguing for something like panpsychism. Consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe.
You could be.
I could be wrong.
Yeah. You could be. I could be. Maverick, what's your ontological position? Yes, as that's quite funny actually. Bearded Heretic just said, "Have a look at the Answers in Reason stream where I was on it and my thoughts on consciousness." There you go. But yeah, you're right.
Or join us again next Tuesday.
Yeah, next Tuesday. Yeah, Bearded Heretic is actually going to be back on, and we're going to be discussing. So we last Tuesday we wanted to discuss consciousness and morality, but we spent most of the show on consciousness. So next week we're going to spend most of it on morality, and then if there's time, we're going to touch on psychopathy, which I think would be incredibly interesting. And Chris might even join us for that one as well, because he's quite interested in
Nice one.
psychopathy. It means I'm going to have to set up a new screen as well, so that there can be 4 of us. Giving me more work. So I'm going to leave the comments now about consciousness, because that's what you're going on, and address the rest of the the conversation that's going on in the chat. God, I can't even converse myself.
I can relate.
Luke says, my view is that babies cannot believe or not believe, so it's an inane point. Yeah, no, that's what we're talking about. Like with the example with a rock being described as vegan or a carnivore or anything like that. Again, they can't eat, or not eat in a way, but there isn't that process. They can't refuse to eat, let's say, a particular thing. Chair says, I understand how you got here versus I agree with you. Yeah, you got to be clever with your language, and I'm not particularly clever, so the fact that you spotted that one, you know. Thanks. Maverick is a form of pantheist. So pantheism is an interesting one. So it's essentially equating the universe with divinity. I actually find it quite interesting. I'm not sure I would necessarily do it myself, but there are times when I'm lying there daydreaming. I sort of imagine the entire universe almost as its own biological organism, and we're just microbes on a tiny cell. But I mean, that's me having a flight of fantasy. But maybe we should have you on to have a conversation about your form of pantheism, because it is some form that I'm actually really interested in. And if I'm honest, I don't know enough about particular people's forms of pantheism, so it would be a learning exercise for me. You can talk away. I'm sure you've seen from these streams, we're not here to tell you you're an idiot for believing whatever you believe. At the end of the day, I'm not going to try and convince you not to believe it. If you're happy believing and you're not hurting anyone, then what do I care?
And it's something we don't often get to discuss within the atheist community itself. So it might be nice to have a discussion and sort of get some ideas out there.
Yeah, definitely. Cafe says, out of curiosity, are either of you guys familiar with perennial philosophy?
No, unfortunately not.
No. So, I mean, Cafe, you're probably going to have to send us some information on that, or if you want us to have a look up of it, we can do that and maybe address it. But if you've got anything in particular you wanted to know, then please, fire away. So yes, Bearded Heretics, looking forward to next week. Yeah.
Yeah, same.
So, do you want to start with psychopathy rather than going into morality? Oh, we could do that, but then I think we're just going to get stuck on psychopathy, because I think it's one of those things that's so interesting, well, that we won't actually address morality. Unless we're all free to start a little bit earlier, and then maybe we'll be able to get the whole stream in. But I know it's a bit of a tight squeeze between your studies and eating and everything like that, Dave.
Yeah. I mean, like I say, I've got the assignment due Tuesday. I'll start it Monday and finish it Tuesday, hopefully. But I might be pushed for time.
Yeah, fair. Well, I mean, we'll have a chat about it, and we'll take that one offline, and we'll sort out the show plan for next Tuesday. So, does anyone else have any more comments before we go? Chesh says, pantheism seems to me to be very personal. Like, depending on who you're talking to, it's so much dependent on the person. I must say, I have noticed that from the conversations I've had about it as well. Although there is someone on Twitter who I've butted heads with recently called Rational Pantheism, and their behavior is anything but. And there's a couple of articles that they have written that the way it's been written in such a derogatory way against atheists and things like that, it's just switched me off straight away, and it's made me completely unreceptive. They might have some very good points. They didn't in their one about atheism being completely irrational, because they were just derogatory the whole way through it. But they might have some good points in their other articles, but it's the way they've presented themselves, which again is what we're talking about, what we atheists do to other people, when we are being, so derogatory, offensive, calling theists idiots for just believing in God, telling them they're irrational, saying we're super smart ones and all that. I mean, none of that is going to progress a conversation, and a lot of it is completely false anyway. So, yeah. Yes, there is panentheism. So panentheism, what's interesting is there are some Christians who are also panentheists. So panentheism is God is basically bigger than the universe and is in everything and everyone. So whereas pantheism is God and the universe are basically the same thing, or you're equating the universe with some form of divinity. Panentheism is sort of God is bigger than the universe, but is in and out of everything. And some Christians argue for a panentheistic take on their personal God, which I find interesting as well. But again, it goes back to the point we were making about there isn't a consistent Christian belief. You have to talk to them about it. But I think it sort of almost goes against some of the things that said within the Bible when they describe it that way. But then they can bring up another verse which seems to say, no, look, it is supported. But yeah, panentheism is interesting. Yes, Randolph, stream's still going. We're pretty much done for the night now. Welcome back though. It is we were just discussing that next week we're going to have Luke back. He's going to be discussing psychopathy and morality from a psychological perspective, and we're going to be comparing the morality side to how it's discussed within philosophy, and seeing if there's any correlation. We'll even be discussing how terms like subjective are used within psychology versus how they're used within philosophy. There's obviously specific ways these terms are used that are contextually correct, but obviously language, especially words like subjective, it's polysemous. So you might hear people saying morality is subjective because X, and then using a term or a definition of subjective that isn't actually how it's used within morality, at least from a philosophical perspective. So that is going to be really interesting conversation. It was great having Luke on last week, and I can't wait to have him back.
He's an awesome dude.
Yeah, definitely. As for what we're going to do on Thursday, we're gonna find an article or something, but we haven't got an idea yet. Well, we got a couple of ideas that we're spitballing, but we're gonna wing it last minute. Is polysemous? Oh, it could be. I suppose anything could be polysemous.
Well, I was going to say we could start an infinite regress by the term subjective is subjective.
Yeah. Pair of you are on the same wavelength tonight. But yeah, cool. Okay, so thank you everybody tonight who has joined in with the stream. Been absolutely fantastic having you all here, especially all the engagement in the chat. I do apologize that I haven't been able to keep up with all of it at all times, but hopefully I got as many as your questions and comments that were relevant, apart from your conversations between yourselves. If I ever do miss anything, please don't feel afraid to say it again when you know that I'm back looking at the chat. I'm happy to address anything when I see it, but you can't always catch up with everything as it's going. So anyway, that's enough for me. You've been listening to the Fresh Air Sci-Fi show discussing the Presumption of Atheism by Anthony Flew. I'm Joe.
And I'm not Anthony Flew.
Have a good night.
Good night, all.